order. Welcome to meeting number 19 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Finance. Pursuant to the order of reference of January 27th of this year, the committee is meeting to study Bill C-224, an act to amend an act to authorize the making of certain fiscal payments to provinces and to authorize the entry into tax collection agreement with provinces. Today's meeting is taking place in hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of January 25th, and therefore members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. The proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website so that you are aware the webcast will always show the person speaking rather than the entirety of the committee. Today's meeting is also taking place in the new webinar format. Webinars are for public committee meetings and are available only to members, their staff, and witnesses. I'd like to then take this opportunity to remind all participants to this meeting that screenshots or taking photos of your screen are not permitted. Similar rules to in the House of Commons. So I'd like to, with that, welcome our first witness, who is Gabriel St. Marie, and this is his private member's bill, Bill C-224, and we will go to witnesses from CRA and Finance in the second hour. I'm told because we are later starting, and we have a experimental vote on the other system at 7:15 Ottawa time. So we will have time to get 2 hours in. So the first hour will go to Mr. St. Marie. And Mr. St. Marie, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Oui, merci, Wayne. Donc,
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be with you this afternoon. Wayne, I'm so sorry to hear about the terrible weather where you are. We have a lot of snow here as well. My daughter did not go to school today. Everything is closed. So I'll deliver a brief presentation. Since 1992, Revenue Quebec has been collecting both the QST and GST, and it's been working very well. To date, Ottawa has always refused to hand over to Revenue Canada the responsibility of collecting federal income tax. This is why Quebecers are the only taxpayers in Quebec who have to produce two tax returns. This double filing brings about major costs for citizens and companies, as well as complications due to the fact that there are 2 points of contact that one must get in touch with. Citizens would win thanks to a single tax filing. It would represent $425 million in savings for the economy, according to the IRAI. That is $39 million for individuals who give the mandate to draft their tax returns to professionals, $99 million in savings for companies, and $287 million in overlap costs. Currently, Quebec, and that's another topic, and yet it is similar. Currently, Quebec has access to tax information abroad only to the extent that the international tax regulations are a copy of federal rules. By closing or agreeing to an agreement with Ottawa, Quebec would have direct access to tax information outside of Canada, which would allow it to independently fight against tax havens rather than having to copy the federal legislation, which is full of holes. Again, this bill is agreed on by consensus in Quebec. The National Assembly has unanimously passed a resolution that is the Quebec, the Liberal Party, the Parti québécois, Québec solidaire are unanimous as well. The Legault government has officially requested this from the Prime Minister. This is largely supported by the population when you look at the surveys as well. All of Quebec Inc. supports this. The representatives of the Chambers of Commerce, Employers Council, independent businesses, the Order of Accountants, and so on. As well, a number of unions like the Quebec Public Service Union and the CSQ are in agreement. The bill does three things. It provides the Minister of Finances the authority to conclude with the government of a province an agreement according which the government of the province will collect federal income taxes from individuals and corporations on behalf of the government of Canada. That's point one. Second point, it orders the Minister of Finances to begin negotiations with the government of Quebec within the 90 days following the coming into effect of the bill after the bill. And thirdly, it orders the government to undertake negotiations with foreign tax authorities so that the government of the province has direct access to its tax authorities to all of the necessary tax information required to implement the agreement. And a very important point here is the issue of jobs. That is of the utmost importance. And again, a reminder to the committee that the federal public service is understaffed and is too concentrated in Ottawa. I therefore ask the government, which is represented here in the House, to maintain the number of jobs of the public service in the regions of Shawinigan and Jonquière, whether this be within the agency where they play a role or within other departments. And in closing, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to quote the member from Rosemont, Mr. Vincent Marisol, who's spokesperson of Quebec Solidaire in the area of finance, taxes, and revenue. He says this: however, beyond all of these very valid arguments, there is a fact for Quebec Solidaire, as for all Quebecers. The single tax that is generated by us, for us, is more than a simple logistical or accounting matter. It is a matter of national dignity. End of quote. This is my presentation. I'd be very happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. St. Marie. And I guess we're out of habit a little bit because we've been meeting in camera so long. I don't have a speaking list from the Conservatives, so if you could just raise your hand. Luke, you're up first? Okay. That'll be great. Okay, then we'll start with Ms. Kotrakis for 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président, et merci à mon collègue, Monsieur Sainte-Marie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to my colleague, Mr. Sainte-Marie. I am truly concerned about the fact that this bill will lead to not only useless costs, but also inefficiencies to administer federal tax returns, but it will also limit the ability of Canada to fight against fiscal fraud and financial crime. Also, this bill will lead to a lot of challenges if we want a consistent system so that Quebecers can have access to benefits administered by the CRA. The CRA does great work to support Canadians during this pandemic, but this bill would undermine thousands of jobs in Quebec and in other provinces as well. Our government made a lot of progress in order to address the concerns for tax consistency, and we promised to streamline tax administration with a simple tax filing system that is automated. I fear that with this bill, we will get rid of the progress that we've seen so far. So here's my first question. In your opening remarks, Mr. Sainte-Marie, in the House, when you spoke about your bill, you said, and I quote, "We've drafted the bill so that all of the jobs in Quebec will be protected. However, the president of the Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada sent a letter to many MPs to ask them to oppose the bill." And here's another quote, I would urge you to oppose Bill C-224 because it will only have negative impact on Quebec, on taxpayers in Quebec, and on tax collection at the federal level. So how do you reconcile these two statements? Answer. Thank you, Annie, for your comments. It was there was a lot of content in your remarks. So obviously, we drafted the bill so that the government would start and negotiate with Quebec in order to protect jobs. As I said earlier, an MP with a private member's bill could not alone protect jobs. That's why I'm asking the federal government to make a commitment and to protect jobs in Shawinigan and Jonquière, to make sure that people who work within the federal public service can keep their job in their region. If not within the CRA, within other departments, because the system is too concentrated in Ottawa. So in my opinion, it would be possible to address the concern that a lot of people in Quebec agree with. We want to simplify the system with a single tax return. And I think that we can still protect jobs because people could work within other departments. As for what you said, you talked about costs, but we are looking at studies that show that there would be savings because there would be a single system. Did harmonizing sales tax increase costs? No, quite the opposite. As for programs administered by the CRA, as soon as we have an agreement between Quebec and Ottawa, and I believe that the CRA will be able to manage those programs. So I believe that the Quebec people are making a legitimate request, and we believe that we can have good negotiations between Quebec and Ottawa so that we can save money and save the jobs. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Sainte-Marie. You talked about costs associated with a single tax filing system that would be administered by Revenu Québec. In your opinion, where will these savings come from, and how can we make sure to make those savings without losing jobs? Because the bulk of the costs are in the salary. So how will we save money if we don't lose any jobs? Thank you for the question. As the IRE study showed, there are costs for individuals that will be saved because they won't have to pay businesses to do their tax returns. And the $297 million would be savings because there would be a single system and jobs would be saved. And here's my point. I'm asking the government to be sensitive. Given the fact that the public service is lacking staff, perhaps the government should make a commitment and should say, okay, we'll find other tasks for these civil servants in these regions. There will be less uncertainty and people will keep their job, but they will be doing something else. So let's protect jobs while maintaining the work that the public service has to do. And how long would Revenu Québec need to change its activities to truly administer the system the same way the CRA does? Answer: I don't have an answer to that question. It will be part of the negotiations between Quebec and Ottawa. In 1991, Robert Bourassa, the Premier of Quebec, struck an agreement to collect sales tax, and it started in 1992, and there was a protocol. So I think it's the same. It's possible. I believe that with my bill, we will finish what was started 30 years ago. So the two levels of government will have to talk.
Round there, and we'll go to Mr. Berthold. I got the order wrong in this first round. We'll go back to letting the Conservatives go first in the second round. Mr. Berthold, 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup. Merci à mon collègue.
Thank you. Thank you to my colleague, Mr. Sainte-Marie, for his bill. There's a lot of nuances between what we're willing to support and what's in the bill, and it's important to discuss those. I would like to remind you to say that Conservative members a few years ago made a resolution to have a single tax return in Quebec. The National Assembly in Quebec also made a formal resolution in 2018. Also in August of 2018, all of the Conservative members throughout the country voted so that Quebec could have only one tax return. And in 2019, a motion was tabled by my colleague that was supported by the Bloc members and not supported by Liberals. And provincial Liberal members in Quebec did not support it either. The goal was to have a single tax return. Here's something that I don't understand in what Mr. Sainte-Marie says. He says that all of the jobs will be saved and millions of dollars will be saved, and he says that the federal government will have to maintain the jobs. So out of $425 million, half of that will not happen.
Well, first of all, greetings once again, and thank you for speaking. I'm very pleased about what you just reminded us. If we can accommodate a legitimate request from Quebec within this parliament, I raise my hat, and we can improve people's lives. In all cases, there are savings because we are eliminating duplication. By eliminating duplication, you're asking the federal government to keep the jobs. So there won't be any real savings in regards to jobs because you wish for employees to stay in the regions and that they stay in Jonquière and Shawinigan, if I understand correctly. I want to be clear. This bill puts an end to duplication. So there will be savings on that end because people who were doing twice the same thing will no longer have to do that. I've met unions in Jonquière and Shawinigan, and of course they have concerns. And of course, jobs at $50,000 or $60,000 in the regions is important. And what I'm suggesting to the government is instead of focusing public service in Ottawa, can you not make an additional effort in order to decentralize it? And in that case, jobs that would be targeted in Shawinigan could be replaced by current jobs that are right now in Ottawa. And I'd like to remind you that we have a lack of staff. So I think it allows us to have savings, and at the same time, Ottawa has a duty to catch up and to decentralize. That's where our positions differ. For us, it's really about filing of the tax return. We could ensure that the work still be done by the CRA in Shawinigan and Jonquière. That's a big difference. You've probably become aware of the Liberal Party's position, who doesn't seem to be very interested in this single tax filing. You seem to want the government to engage in discussions that Liberals will be sincere if the bill is adopted by opposition party because they want to agree with Quebec, when we already know that they're against single tax filing. You raise an important point. First of all, it's not a motion. It's a bill in this case. And secondly, we have to remind the government that the government, its boss, is us all, which is why the House has a very important role. It represents legislators. And if the House asks the government to undergo those negotiations, the government has to undergo those negotiations. Otherwise, it has to do with trust in the government. Well, I'm quite skeptical because starting discussions and concluding them is two separate things. And from what we hear from the Liberals until now, I don't think it will be truly possible. The Bloc Québécois, unfortunately, because of your functions, you will never be able to do it alone. So the only solution that I can see is a conservative government which thinks in the same way as you and who could ultimately realize and implement the single tax filing for Quebecers, because we have the will to do it, and we also have the will to adequately represent Quebec's voters and the National Assembly who have asked for it in a very unanimous way. I think it's important to recognize the fact that, unfortunately, with the Liberals, we're going towards an impasse if we ask them just to start discussions, because I have the impression that the result is already biased. I can already say that the bill, they have 3 months to start negotiations, and after that they have a year to agree, and then it's up to the House and legislators to send that information to the government. So I am confident.
We will have to end it there, and we'll go to Mr. Theron with the block. Just to be clear, the signed-in member is Mr. St. Marie, but we usually don't have a problem, Mr. Theron, at this committee with letting somebody else on. So I think you and Mr. Saber are both going to want to be on the list. Go ahead, Mr. Theron. 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for welcoming me. I was in a symposium in 2019 on single tax filing, and the expert in tax filing and tax returns and on all the issues related to having two tax returns was Mr. Vaillancourt, and he was asked during his intervention what he thought of the possible job losses with single tax filing. And I'm not saying I said, and he said that it would not cause any job losses. I'd like to explain the logic of that. Mr. St. Marie, the QST and the GST is managed between the government of Quebec and the government of Canada. Yes, exactly. And that's to put an end to duplication. So we'd be saving $145 million because we wouldn't be paying twice, or rather two people to do the same job, which means we'd be saving $145 million. Yes, exactly. And what's been proven is that duplications at CRA are at 56%, which means that 56% of the CRA's activities that is done by the Quebec Revenue Agency, which leads to $297 million in economies. So citizens have the same services, but we're saving $297 million. Am I good so far, if I understand? So a bit more than half, 56%. So people are doing things in duplicate. Yes, exactly. According to the Minister of Revenue, there are all these jobs, 5,300 jobs for the federal tax return. So if we remove 56%, which is duplication, there's 44% left of the 5,300 people who have to be kept to file tax returns. Is that right so far? Yes. So of the 5,300 people, there are 2,332 people who would still be employed by one of the two agencies, and we need them because we'd have more work, because we'd be doing more tax returns, but we would only need 2,300 people to do the same job. So those savings of $297 million, that's where they are. Am I right, Mr. St. Marie? Well, I'm following you well. The 2,332 people at the Revenue Agency who are doing a job that's not already done by the Quebec agency, these people have to be kept, which means that Revenue Quebec would take those 2,300 people and would hire them, and in that case, we would only technically lose 2,900 jobs. So there would be 2,900 people left who could go do other jobs, and they would be more productive for a nation that needs a strong public service where they are actually in need of more employees. And if we look at attrition, the number of people who are retiring every year, that's 3% for the CRA, which is 44,000 people. So in attrition, over 3,000 people will be retiring in the next few years. So am I right so far? Is it logical what I'm saying so far? Well, I'm still following you. So there's a way to protect jobs, all the while having the savings that you mentioned. And what the Bloc has been asking for several years now is to decentralize the public service, to get it out of Ottawa so that it benefits all regions. A $50,000 job in Shawinigan has a bigger impact than in Ottawa. And in the 2,332 jobs that we're keeping in that could be useful for the Quebec government, those jobs could be in Shawinigan and in Jonquière. With an agreement with the Quebec government, they would have to keep part of those public servants in the regions where they're already attributed. Am I right? Yes, I completely agree. Therefore, when we're talking about the QST and the GST and the savings of $297 million, why can't we do the same thing for the Public Service Alliance of Canada? What is there here that I'm missing? Why would there be an issue to understand the savings of $297 million? Well, I agree with you. I also don't understand that. I'd like to remind you that it is the Liberal government of Quebec's Minister of Finances, Mr. Séguin, who presented this in the early 2000s. I hope we can accomplish this. I know that request was tabled in May 2018 because I tabled it. And when I tabled it, the CAQ, QS, and even Philippe Couillard's Federalist Party voted for it. Even Philippe Couillard, who was extremely federalist, voted for this motion unanimously. When Mr. Berthold says that we're not sure if it's good for Quebec, well, Quebec is asking for it unanimously at the National Assembly, and the Bloc Québécois is there to answer the interests of Quebec. So you can vote for it then.
And we'll go to Mr. Julian with the NDP. We'll see if your mic works there too, Peter. And if somebody could give me a signal from the Conservatives who's next, they're first on next round. Okay, Mr. Julian.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I hope you can hear me well.
Monsieur Saint-Marie.
Yes, and thank you, Mr. Saint-Marie, for your bill, which is very interesting. The NDP voted for it, of course, because we have had members in the past from the NDP who had similar approaches. That being said, I'd like to say from the outset that having lived in Quebec for several years, having had to file 2 tax returns, I've understood the importance on an individual basis for people who have to file their tax return, the first one, and then file a second tax return. I even had to take some classes in Sherbrooke in order to understand the nuances between the 2 tax returns. And when you think of all the time spent by people on these tax returns, it represents a lot of time. And that is one of the things you speak to in your bill. Now, the NDP's position has always been that we have to keep those jobs. And as a former resident of the Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean, where I learned my French, and I learned my French in Chicoutimi, I understand the valuable work that Jonquière and Shawinigan public servants do. They are very devoted. They are very efficient in their work. They do high quality work. And living in those 4 regions of Quebec, I also understand the contribution of these jobs on a regional basis. Now, Monsieur Terrien, unfortunately, just spoke about people who are useful. In our opinion, all these positions are useful and necessary. And we're really listening to the PSAC in Quebec, which is talking about the importance of keeping all these jobs.
Alors, ma première question, c'est justement ça.
That would be my first question. So if we are speaking about eliminating jobs when there's a great deal of work to be accomplished, that does worry me. Because that, when we're speaking about a single tax return, we're also talking about maintaining these jobs and to expand the mandate regarding taxes. So my question, Mr. Sainte-Marie, is this. Well, first of all, thank you for this bill. But my question is this. Could you address the possibility of maintaining all of the jobs that we currently have? Thank you very much, Mr. Julian, for your presentation and for your comments. They're very relevant. Thank you also very much for the support of the NDP in the second reading of this bill. First of all, the purpose of this bill is to tie a legitimate will, which is greatly shared by all of Quebec, to, as you mentioned, filing a single tax return rather than 2, and to, of course, also make sure that the jobs are maintained in Shawinigan and Jonquière, and I'm very sensitive to that. I have discussed this with him. My colleague Alain Terrien is not at all calling into question, nor do I call into question, the quality of the work performed by the employees of CRA, but rather is that we have one employee at Revenue Quebec who's doing the same job as somebody else at CRA, so we're seeing duplication. And this duplication is unfortunate for the taxpayer who has to fill in 2 tax returns. It's unfortunate for a company having to file twice, but in terms of efficiency, it is also problematic. But of course, this bill requires negotiation between Quebec and Ottawa. And I'm asking the government to be very sensitive to this. In this bill, there is a portion indicating that we have to be careful about the jobs. And I'm asking the federal government whether or not it would be possible to make sure that there are a certain number of jobs in the civil service that would remain in Shawinigan and in Jonquière, so that we maintain the same number of jobs. There will be certain roles to be played at CRA with a single tax filing. Employees could remain there. But at the same time, they could work for other departments, as long as the government puts in the request that the level of activity of the civil service remains at Jonquière and Shawinigan. It could be immigration, for example. Mr. Julian in the House, you said that it could be CRA that could be better equipped to fight tax havens, for instance. But that all depends on the will of the government. And I'm putting in that request because, like you, I realize that a job that pays $50,000 in Shawinigan and Jonquière is important. Yes, but let us be clear. And I only have a few seconds left. So you're advocating that all of the positions of civil servants currently working at CRA could be maintained for a single filing system, because in my mind that isn't quite clear. Are you advocating that all of these jobs should be maintained? Let me try and be more clear. The single tax filing, of course, aims at avoiding overlap. The same employee who does the same work, we'd only keep 1 rather than 2. But for years now, to my knowledge, the Bloc, as the NDP, has been asking that the civil service apparatus be less concentrated in Ottawa, be more distributed in the regions. And right now, there's understaffing at the agency. So we'd eliminate overlap. What we're asking the government to do is to make sure that we save the jobs in the regions. You could have jobs that could be in Ottawa, or again, they might be relocated to Shawinigan or Jonquière, or yet again, as the civil service is now seeing short staffing, you could develop hiring strategies in other departments, for instance, and to make sure that this takes place in Shawinigan or Jonquière to stabilize these jobs. So I hope that that is sufficiently clear.
Thank you. Thank you both. We'll go to Mr. Lawrence for a 5-minute round, followed by Ms. Zerowitz. Mr. Lawrence.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for appearing today, our great colleague there. First, I just wanted to just clarify, all this bill really calls for is a negotiation, right? You have to enter in a negotiation within 3 months, and then you're calling on them to have a negotiation within a year. Is that correct, Monsieur?
Oui, tout à fait.
Yes, absolutely.
The other thing that one of the things that the Liberal Party has raised as a criticism is that if these negotiations are successful, that it would call on Quebec having to enter into new tax treaties with every single country that we have a tax treaty with right now. I would just like, on friendly terms, give you an opportunity to respond to that criticism.
Oui, donc merci.
Thank you very much for that question. In fact, this question is often raised with respect to international tax treaties. But just a reminder to the committee that it is a fairly standard procedure. This is an amendment to an existing treaty. We would not draft or create new treaties. It would simply be an amendment. So it's a very frequent practice. And if I could cite an example, for example, Barbados doesn't have the mandate to interpret the Constitution or the laws of Canada. It will be the government that says to it. It'll be the Department of Revenue, for instance, that will have the authority to exchange tax information, or afterwards it'll be CRA. And that could be Revenue Quebec through an agreement signed between Quebec and Ottawa. This would, of course, limit Revenue Quebec's authority to the taxpayers in Quebec, of course.
Okay, and just following up on one of the comments you made in your opening statement, you said that it might give the Quebec the ability to close loopholes that the federal government is currently allowing in terms of tax havens. I'm a little bit confused by that, I'll be honest, because we can't really change the legislation or the tax. As you said, we're just going to amend those tax treaties. How is the province of Quebec going to be able to enforce things that the federal government cannot?
Eh bien, par simple volonté.
Well, through a simple political will, if I may say it like that. For example, the taxation of giant web developers. Quebec has started doing this and it's working well. Similarly, if Quebec were to decide to undertake more investigations for residents who are using tax havens, that is, residents of Quebec who use tax havens illegally, the Revenue Quebec would have the ability to obtain information directly, just like CRA currently has the authority to do. But the government is somewhat lax in this issue, so they're not moving ahead very quickly. This brings to mind the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers as examples. Each country went to identify some cases, and Canada has done nothing. So there's a lack of political will in this arena.
Do I have any time left, Wayne? Chair? Okay. Can I give that last time to my colleague, Mr. Berthold?
Yes, you can. Time for one question here, Mr. Berthold.
Oui, je voulais juste rassurer M. Terrien.
I'd just like to reassure Mr. Terrien, we agree with a single tax filing. Otherwise, we would not have voted for this. If we had not voted in favor, we certainly wouldn't be here speaking about it. However, we have some concerns as to the intent. Because Mr. Sainte-Marie spoke about Québec Solidaire and their position on a single tax filing. That's very different from having a single form. And I believe Mr. Marissart from Québec Solidaire wants to ensure that Quebec manages both federal and provincial taxes itself. And we don't agree with this at all. Well, we want to see that Quebecers fill only a single tax return and that there's an administrative agreement signed between both governments so that the Quebec population can only sign a single tax return. We don't want to get into other treaties, etc. Those are the nuances. If we want to go further and have this bill passed, I want us to go further, and I want Mr. Sainte-Marie to be much more specific as to the intent behind this bill. Do you want Quebecers to only produce a single tax return or to have an agreement with Revenue Canada, or do you want to take complete control over tax matters? That's a completely different optic. Well, what the bill says is that there would be an agreement between Quebec and Ottawa and that there would be a single tax return. You only need to produce one in a single wicket. And rather than producing something, for example, for a company before Revenue Canada and CRA. So we want to put an end to this duplication, and we would do this through beginning negotiations between Quebec and Ottawa.
Thank you all. We'll now go to Ms. Zerowitz, who will be followed by Mr. Terrain. Ms. Zerowitz.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. I'm just going to pump up the jam, as they say. Thank you so much, Mr. Sainte-Marie. Thank you for your presentation today. I will, Mr. Lawrence actually started on the track that I was going to go on, which is about you had talked in your original comments when you introduced this law in the House about this law would enable Quebec to fight more effectively against the use of tax havens. And I just want to, just for the record, dispute your next comment here where it says, since Ottawa is dragging its feet in that regard. I know I will tell you, Davenport residents, the people of my riding, really care about people paying their fair share of taxes, and they get very angry when they start hearing about tax havens. I will tell you that I was very proud of our government putting over $400 million, I believe, within the first year of us being in office to fight these tax havens and to fight those that are trying to avoid paying their fair share of taxes. And we've actually increased it to over $1 billion now. And the reason we did that, Mr. Sainte-Marie, is because it's actually been effective. So I know that the Minister of National Revenue is very passionate about this issue, and I don't want to do disservice to her and the amazing team of people that are working very hard on this. So I will, I didn't hear an answer in terms of how Quebec is going to be more effective on its own in terms of against the use of tax havens. So perhaps maybe I'll sort of give you sort of a few minutes if you could maybe tell me how you think you could be more effective, and then I have another question for you.
OK, merci. Quand on regarde ce que...
When you look at what Canada does to fight tax havens, both legally and illegally, but that might become illegal, and you compare this to the United States, to the EU, to other countries in the world, unfortunately, Canada falls short and is simply lagging behind. And this goes back a number of decades. And it isn't trivial. It's even part of the role played by the ministers of finance. For example, Paul Martin, when he was Minister of Finance, had his personal corporation, the Canadian Steamship Lines, which flies its flag in Nigeria and also Barbados. So is it of interest to him to close Barbados as a tax haven? He benefits from it. Let's look at previous ministers of finance, Mr. Marnoux, whom I respect, but his family company, again, today, if you look at his webpage, it'll indicate that if you're an insurance company or pension fund company, and he's ready to prepare advice for you how to prepare tax havens to avoid paying tax here. And if you look at the major banks, for example, in Toronto, the Bay Street banks, they all have subsidiaries in tax havens. As a result, they're able to save a lot of tax. Whereas, to my knowledge, this is an industry that is protected. It is safe from foreign competition. It's extremely profitable. We see that quarterly. We see record payments being made. And I'm proud of this system because it's very stable and it is a good banking system, even though I prefer the Quebec cooperative model. Nevertheless, internationally, it is a good system. But why enable them to use these maneuverings? And that is the merger between a political and economic forces in Canada. But to go back to your question, right now, if Revenue Quebec suspects fraud, somebody who is fraudulent and who has tax havens, we cannot confirm that information there because the data they're trying to obtain can only be provided by CRA. and they have not been given the go-ahead from the government to respond to that, to do something at the end of the day. Therefore, Canada really does not stand tall when it comes to the fight against tax havens worldwide, and this needs to change.
Ms. Hurwitz.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chair. And I share also, and I think this has come up a few times, just in terms of the potential for loss of jobs. As you know, our federal government is always ready to work to simplify the lives of Quebecers and all Canadians. But the reason we're not aligned with the single, provincial forum. But I think what I'm hearing you saying is, yes, if this was allowed to happen in Quebec, we would be more efficient. There might be some impact on jobs, but we would rely on the federal government to save those jobs, even though they don't believe in the single provincial form and they don't think that'll make us more efficient. So is that what you're trying to say? Even though there might be an impact on the jobs, it's up to the federal government to actually save those jobs in Quebec?
Deux choses.
Two things. That's right. The fact that workers are doing the same work twice, there's duplication, and the goal of my bill is to eliminate that duplication. So obviously, it's putting pressure on jobs, but at the same time, I recognize the importance of having jobs in the regions. But given the fact that there's a lack of employees in the federal public service and most of the jobs in Ottawa, well, first of all, Ottawa will have to negotiate with Quebec, and many of those jobs could keep the conditions of collective agreements and could be transferred to Revenu Québec if employees are in agreement with that. But given that there's not enough staff within the federal public service, I think that the federal government could say, yes, these are important jobs for the regions, so we'll give those workers other jobs. They could work for other departments. And there's a great document from the Library of Parliament that says that there's 11% of workers for Revenu Québec, which is lower than our share of the population. So I think that if there was less concentration of workers in Ottawa, jobs could be saved. Thank you.
Thank you both. Turning to Mr. Theron, who will be followed by Mr. Julian. 2.5-minute rounds.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Sainte-Marie, I think we have a great edge. We have a small lab of what we want to do. That is what we are doing with sales tax. We decided that there would be a unique system to collect sales tax. Each level of government gets 72 million more every year. So if Quebec collects the sales tax, but does that mean that the federal government can still increase or decrease the federal sales tax? Answer, yes. Yes, here we would just want to make things easier for companies, and Ottawa would keep all of its sovereignty for taxation purposes. The only difference would be that Revenu Québec would be collects taxes, and both levels save a lot of money. And no one ever challenged that. Everyone thinks that it's a good idea. Answer, it took a while to implement the idea, but no one has ever wanted to backtrack. And I think it would be the same thing for tax filings. So you're recommending that there be one system, but Ottawa could still make its own decisions, could tell Quebec, I want you to get that amount of money in taxpayers' pockets. Yes, exactly. And all of the information would have to be shared. So there would be no loss of fiscal or tax autonomy for Ottawa. No, that's not the goal of the bill. You're right. Earlier, I told you that there's over 5,000 jobs and 2,300 are for collecting taxes. So it means that there's a lot of workers that are available and paid that would be available to the federal public service for other tasks? Answer, that would be an option. It would depend on the negotiations and on the will of the federal government. Would the federal government want to maintain jobs in the regions? Is it a priority for the federal government? It's a priority for my party. So the resources would be reallocated in an optimal way. Answer, yes, and that would be an option with my bill. We would no longer pay two people who are doing the same work, and we would be using resources more efficiently. So that's economist talk.
We'll have to
Merci,
end
Monsieur le
it,
Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
followed by Mr. Kelly. I believe,
merci.
Mr. Kelly, you're on, following Mr. Julian. Go ahead, Peter.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And once again, thank you, Mr. Sainte-Marie. Well, now, I do not agree with Ms. Zerowitz, who just said that the federal government does its part to fight against tax havens. As you know full well, the parliamentary budget officer told us about $25 billion every year that go to tax havens. And the CR is not doing anything about it. Why? Because we know full well that the government never provided the required tools to its civil servants. And that's what we heard this summer. And I know that you're aware, Mr. Sainte-Marie, and civil servants said that the reason why not a single large corporation was affected and that were mentioned in the Bahamas or Panama Papers, well, the reason is that civil servants do not have the tools. They don't have the legislative tools, administrative tools to fight this tax havens that cost at least $25 billion a year. So, Mr. Sainte-Marie, I'd like to hear you talk about how we could change that situation. And in particular, I'd like you to talk about criticisms that we often hear about information exchange agreements. How would that work with a single tax return in Quebec? Thank you, Mr. Julian, for your comments. And I totally agree with you. As you know, we believe that it is extremely unfair that tax havens exist and large companies use tax havens in all impunity. There was a parliamentary commission in Quebec on tax havens, and one of the conclusions was that, well, the power is in Ottawa. So even if we wanted to do more, we could not because we do not have access to information abroad. So we're very limited. So here is what I think. If my bill passes, Quebec will be able to fight tax havens, and that could influence Ottawa to do the same. Just like what is happening with pharmacare and with subsidized daycare. These are programs that started in Quebec. And also, Quebec already collects taxes from web giants, and Ottawa will start doing that soon. So that could influence Ottawa to do the right thing. So if the Quebec government would want to do something, well, it can't because we do not have access to information abroad, and my bill would solve that issue. So let's see what the Americans did for the Panama Papers. Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Julian.
Roll there, Gabrielle. We'll go to Mr. Kelly and close off with Mr. Sabera. Mr. Kelly.
Well, félicitations.
Congratulations, Mr. Sainte-Marie, for your bill that is now in second reading. I agree with you. It's a good idea.
Just more or less the same thing in the last Parliament, and I know that that you had supported the Conservative motion that we made then, and was a good idea and a good idea now to get Quebecers onto only a single tax return. I don't think anybody would want any Canadian to have to duplicate that process each year. Your bill, though, is very specific to Quebec. And what would you say or comment on to other provinces that may wish to be the tax collector for their province? This is an idea that has been discussed in other provinces. There was the Fair Deal panel in Alberta examined the issue. Now, I understand that this issue is, of course, much more urgent to people in Quebec that already have to file 2 returns, and I'm quite certain that nobody in Alberta would want to file two returns. But would you support any other province that might prefer that there and Alberta, for example, does have its own tax collection department as well, but only for corporate income tax, not for personal. So in Alberta, corporate filers, including small business operators, do have to file 2 tax returns, and there are thousands of them in Alberta that do, and probably would prefer to only file 1. Do you have any comment on how your bill or a similar one might apply to other provinces?
Oui, bon, d'abord, merci, monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly, for your comments. And first off, congratulations for your great French at the beginning of your comments. I'm taking note. And I can help you practice your French, which is excellent, by the way. I'd like to remind you that according to the Constitution, tax collection is a provincial jurisdiction, even though Ottawa asked provinces to collect taxes for the First World War, to reimburse the debt for the economic crisis for the Second World War, and then to pay back the debt. Ottawa, every time, told the provinces that it was temporary. And in 1954, the province of Quebec reminded Ottawa that it was a temporary measure, and Quebec said, we will have our own tax returns. So within the Constitution, it is a provincial jurisdiction, and each province decides that Ottawa can keep the system, but it's not an obligation. So currently, here's what the Act says. Ottawa can collect taxes instead of provinces, but the opposite is not true. But with my bill, it would be possible. It says that Quebec is a nation, and the Quebec Legislative National Assembly passed a unanimous motion. So my bill asked that the reverse be possible. And if Alberta wanted the same, it would be doable with my bill. Thank you.
When we debated the single tax return motion in the previous parliament, critics of the motion at the time raised concerns about the different definitions of income in Quebec. And I would anticipate that you're going to hear these objections again, perhaps directly from officials in the next panel. What would you say to critics that point to that as a significant obstacle to getting Quebecers onto a single tax return?
Merci pour l'intervention.
Thank you for your comments. The goal of the bill is to simplify the lives of taxpayers. If CRA uses other definitions that are used by Revenu Québec, Quebec could get that information and could share it to the CRA, just like for the harmonization of sales tax. So Ottawa decides on the tax rate, and the Revenu Québec collects that tax rate as decided by Ottawa. So for the single tax return, Revenu Québec would send the CRA the information that's requested, and Ottawa would keep its sovereignty for its tax policy in Quebec. It would just simplify everything. There would be less red tape. Thank you.
We'll thank you both there, and we'll wrap it up with Mr. St. Marie, with you, Mr. Sabara, and then we have to go to a motion for Mr. Falk, a very fast one. Mr. Severa.
Thank you, Chair. About 2 minutes or so, if I understand that
No,
correctly?
you've got 3.5 or 4. Go
Okay,
ahead.
thank you, Mr. Chair. Great to be here with everyone this afternoon on a very important topic. Mr. St. Marie, always nice to see you, and thank you for your interventions today. One comment and one theme that we've touched upon this afternoon has been the theme of tax evasion. And we know and we expect all Canadians and all Canadian organizations and businesses to pay their fair share of taxes so that we can provide the wonderful services that we do to Canadians. And through the pandemic, obviously, the federal government has provided the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, the student benefit, the wage subsidy, and a number of programs, and also supported Canadians that were in long-term care homes, including in the province of Quebec, where we had the Canadian Armed Forces, the Canadian military go and assist to long-term care homes, both in the province of Quebec and the province of Ontario. It's great to see a Team Canada approach being taken during COVID. With regards to tax evasion, though, Mr. St. Marie, excuse me, and with regards to Mr. Julian as well, our government, and I sat on the Finance Committee for the first 4 years or 5 years when we won the first election, our government made it a priority to fight tax evaders both here in Canada and abroad. So, for example, in 2013-14 fiscal year, the CRA only had the resources to perform 43 audits related to international tax evasion. And remember the years under the Conservatives where agencies and departments were starved and had their budgets cut back and couldn't get the resources, including shuttering veterans offices across Canada. We know the Conservative record. You know, last year, the number of audits that were taken went from 43 in 2013-14 all the way to 1,463 in the last fiscal year. We invested over $1 billion into the Canada Revenue Agency so they can have the resources to make those investigations that are necessary. You know, to go on, Mr. St. Marie, and to my colleagues, just wanted to point out, in budgets 2016-2017, we had anticipated these investments would generate additional assessments of $5 billion by fiscal year 2022. But in fact, by April of 2020, we had already exceeded $6.6 billion in assessments with regards to fighting tax evasion, both here in Canada and abroad. You know, we have currently 55 ongoing criminal cases with an offshore tax evasion component. And we've had 32 criminal convictions for tax evasion. So when we look at the government's record over the last number of years, and we also remember is that Canada must enter into tax treaties with foreign jurisdictions. One of them, and I was glad to work on the Finance Committee, was with regards to base erosion profit shifting, the BIPs. Again, the Canadian government taking leadership with our partners internationally, doing what was right, ensuring that all Canadians, whether it's on an individual basis or organization, pay their fair share of taxes. So, you know, I do need to correct the record, Mr. St. Marie.
And your question is?
And my question is, wouldn't you recognize that the Canadian government is doing what's right for Canadians across this country, including the wonderful people that live in Quebec?
Bien, merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Sorbara, for your comment and your question. And I must say that it's always a pleasure when you're here at the committee or in the House. You have a brilliant mind, and I love listening to you, and I love exchanging ideas with you. What I would answer very quickly is that despite all that, when we look at the fight against tax evasion with the BPS that you were talking about with the OECD, Canada is still at the end, is still dragging its feet. It's the opinion of all experts. It's very far from what's being done elsewhere. So Canada still has a lot to do, and Quebec would like to do a lot more. And this bill would allow Quebec to do more and could inspire Ottawa. Thank you.
We will end it there because we have another panel to go to. Thank you, Mr. St. Marie, for coming forward, and congratulations for getting your bill this far. Very interesting exchange. With that, Mr. Falk, you had a quick motion, I think, that you wanted to put before the committee. Oh, and before you do that, I see him sitting out there with a BC flag behind him. Welcome to Ed Fast, a new member of the committee, the official critic or shadow minister, I guess, minister for the official opposition. We brings better balance. Now we have 2 from the Atlantic and 2 from BC. There, Ed, will kind of balance it up with those Central Canadians.
Glad to join you all. Thanks, Wayne.
Welcome, Ted.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I too want to welcome Mr. Fast to the committee. We're looking forward to his participation and leadership here at this committee. And because of that, we're currently not in a position where we have a vice chair, and I would like to nominate Pat Kelly to fill that position.
Okay, it's been moved. Is there any discussion? I don't expect there's any opposition. All those in favor?
Fine choice.
Opposed? Carried. Welcome, Pat, as vice chair.
Thank you very much. And Wayne, I know you've got a storm there. If your power goes out, don't worry. I will be right there to make sure that the committee continues to function seamlessly, just as my predecessor did.
All right, that's good. Depending on who the witness would be, I would expect, Mr. Kelly, for sure. That was a moment. Okay, we will now bring in our, I don't think we need to suspend. I guess we do have to suspend for a minute. Do we, Mr. Clerk?
Monsieur le Président.
Yep.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to very quickly ask that we adopt a motion of congratulations to thank the Vice President, Mr. Poilievre, for all the work he's done in this committee. I second that.
To that, all those in favor? Opposed? Carried. Then we'll send them a note. I already did thank him, Gabriel, the other day. I was talking to him. Okay. Then, Mr. Clerk, do we have to suspend to bring in the? I see Andrew on there, or can we just roll along? Okay. Then we will we'll welcome our next witnesses. From the Department of Finance, Mr. Marsland, Senior Assistant Deputy Minister, Tax Policy. And I don't see, yep, well, they must be here. Maidrag Janovic, Associate Assistant Deputy Minister, Tax Policy Branch. And from Canada Revenue Agency, Wayne Lepine, Director General Policy, and Mirella LaRouche, Assistant Commissioner with the Chief Data Office and Chief Service Officer, Service Innovation and Integration Branch. So with that, I believe 2 folks have opening remarks. We'll start with who wants to go first, Mr. Janovic or Mr. Marsland? Go ahead, Mr. Marsland. Did we lose you? Oh, there you are. You must be on mute, Andrew.
Thank you.
There we go.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je veux...
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank you for inviting me to speak to Private Members Bill C-224. I'm pleased to be here. Bill C-224 proposes to authorize the Minister of Finance to enter into an agreement with the government of a province under which the government of the province would collect the federal, personal, and corporate income taxes on behalf of the Government of Canada. It also seeks to require that employment-related impacts be mitigated within 90 days of the coming into force of the Act. The Minister of Finance undertake discussions with the Government of Quebec in order to enter into an agreement within 1 year. Upon entering into an agreement with the provincial government, the Government of Canada must renegotiate its agreements with foreign tax authorities to give the province direct access to international tax information. Perhaps by way of context, I will say a few words about the administration of income taxes across Canada. As the committee will be aware, most provincial income taxes are collected on behalf of provinces by the CRA, as established under the long-standing tax collection agreements.
Used to collect and administer provincial taxes virtually free of charge, in exchange for which the provinces agree to maintain a common tax base between the federal and provincial systems. This helps ensure harmonization of the tax systems, reduces complexity both in administration and compliance. At the same time, provinces and territories have the flexibility to set tax rates and introduce credits to reflect their particular policy choices. Quebec, of course, does not have a tax collection agreement for personal income taxes or corporate taxes, and Quebec and Alberta don't have one for corporate income taxes. As such, these provinces administer their own provincial tax systems and are not required to adhere to a common tax base. Over time, in the absence of adherence to a common tax base, different and reasonable policy choices have been made with respect to how various categories of income or expenditures are treated for income tax purposes. Consequently, it's important to consider how these differences in policy approaches contribute to the respective compliance burden faced by taxpayers in different provinces. In other words, the question of compliance burden goes beyond who is administering the law or the tax, but also importantly involves elements of the system itself. Finally, as the committee is aware, while the focus of the bill is on tax administration, beyond the collection of taxes, the Canada Revenue Agency delivers benefits to Canadians, such as the Canada Child Benefit for individuals and the Scientific Research and Experimental Development Program for corporations. More immediately, over the past 12 months, the agency has played a critical role in the timely delivery of a range of emergency relief benefits to Canadians, individuals, and businesses, leveraging the agency's role in tax administration across the country. So along with our colleagues from the Canada Revenue Agency, we'd be very pleased to answer any questions the committee may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Marsland, and I believe it's Mr. Lepine who has the second set of remarks from the CRA.
I actually do,
okay.
Chair.
Go ahead, Ms. LaRouche.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Merci de m'avoir invité pour parler du projet de loi C-224.
Thank you for inviting me. As mentioned by the chair, I'm accompanied by Mr. Wayne Lepine. Following my finance colleague's remarks, I would like to draw the committee's attention to certain impacts relating to this bill. In particular, I would like to emphasize 4 impacts that we believe are very important. First of all, uncertainty about jobs. The agency employs close to 6,000 employees in Quebec in 13 different offices. The agency's workloads are national, meaning that the work of a particular province can be done in several other provinces. Therefore, although the impact on jobs would be most significant in the province, which would choose to repatriate tax operations, many jobs across the country could be impacted. Secondly, the disruption of agencies' activities not related to tax processes. In addition to administering tax legislation, the agency administers benefit programs from which all Canadians may benefit. Most of these benefit programs that the agency administers on behalf of other departments or organizations are based on tax returns. Given that one must file a tax return to receive benefits, it is not possible to administer benefit programs without tax information. A transfer of administration to a province could impede the administrative effectiveness of these programs, which are crucial for the well-being of Canadians. Without tax information on hand, COVID-19 emergency benefits would not have been possible to implement as quickly. This also applies to the Guaranteed Income Supplement administered by ESDC, for which eligibility is based on tax information. If tax administration is transferred to the province, whereas the agency continues administering benefits, taxpayers will continue interacting with both organizations, possibly creating confusion and dissatisfaction. Third, efficiency in international taxation. The CRA must ensure tax compliance in Canada and abroad. Canada has signed many international tax treaties and tax information exchange agreements. These are critical to our effectiveness. Convincing our partners to make changes to include other subnational tax administrations is not a given. And finally, the fourth thing to consider is the cost increase and loss of economies of scale. The required integration between both organizations' processes and technology infrastructures could result in additional expenses. The costs related to the functioning and significant investments in infrastructure by the agency to serve all Canadians will not decrease with such a transfer. Based on the current experience with GST, HST administration by Quebec, the cost of administering federal tax by the province would be higher than what it would cost the agency because of the economies of scale that CRA can reach.
In closing, regarding the special situation of Quebec, it's important to emphasize our efforts to collaborate with the provinces with Revenue Quebec in order to reduce the administrative burden imposed on Quebecers. We started discussions in order to simplify or combine a number of forms and to simplify the tax return process by focusing first and foremost on vulnerable sectors of the population. We're also studying other factors, and their implementation would facilitate taxpayers' work with both organizations, for example, working with software providers when it comes to producing a tax return, and secondly, coordinate the validation and verification processes between both the organizations to avoid being audited twice.
To answer any questions you may have.
Okay, thank you both for that presentation. And we will first start with the Conservatives. Is it Mr. Berthold who's first? That'll be followed by Mr. Fraser. Go ahead, Mr. Berthold.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much from our representatives of the Department of Finance and CRA for your comments. I'm going to use a very Quebec word. I'm flabbergasted hearing what I've just heard. Most parliamentarians at the House of Commons passed a resolution to move ahead with this bill to produce a single tax filing. I would be surprised to see CRA give us information about how to make this possible and not to tell us the opposite. That's what I would have expected. That is everything that is negative in this bill, whereas the very purpose of this bill is to facilitate the life of Quebecers. In part, I agree on what you said about international treaties, and we'll have an opportunity to discuss this further with Mr. Sainte-Marie regarding the inclusion of this portion that covers international agreements, which might undermine the passing of this bill. But Mrs. Laroche, to come back to your 4 points, frankly, I'm disappointed with the content of your presentation. I would have liked you to show us a means of moving forward to make the simplification easier for Quebecers. That is to file a single tax return. Are you telling us that today this is completely impossible based on the 4 points to raise to file a single tax returns for Quebecers who would be administered by the province of Quebec? Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for that question. And I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of tech issues. The agency has committed to delivering the best possible service to all taxpayers, both Quebec and elsewhere. This is why we have launched many initiatives aimed at simplifying how these services are delivered. But the points I raised do not give rise to the conclusion that this is impossible. Rather, what I've raised is a consideration, things that legislators in the committee must look at when it comes to the complexity of the current situation and the various considerations that must be taken into account. Yes, but Mrs. Laroche, would this have been possible for GST? The purpose, of course, is not to realize economies of scale. The primary objective, at least as far as the Conservative Party is concerned, is to facilitate the life of Quebecers. You said yourself that you began discussions, but that haven't completed in order to simplify taxpayers' life. So in our minds, having a single tax return that would be administered by the two levels of government that does not remove the independence of a CRA to deliver services or administrate these. Honestly, I don't really see the link between the available information, which is available both to CRA and also makes it possible for them to deliver benefits to Canadians, such as the CER with the CERB. Apparently, in my mind, there is no conflict there. My question to you is would it be possible for Canada Revenue Agency to have a game plan in place to show us how we could carry out a single tax return filing for Quebec taxpayers? Well, when you look...
Could come in for a minute, Ms. LaRoche. If this is passed by the House, Mr. Berthold, we would expect the CRA to carry that out. But I do think, as a public servant, what I expect from public servants is to give us the facts as they see them based on their experience. We can agree or disagree, but I want to hear the facts that the public service has to lay out before us. Go ahead, Mr. LaRoche. Ms. LaRoche.
If I may, Mr. Easter.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you.
I want to have the facts, but I want to have the facts on the both sides. So that's why I'm asking those questions. I already read the speech, and I saw the fact against, and I now looking for the facts in favor of this. And what is motivating me is the well-being of Quebecers who have to fill two single tax returns.
Okay, we'll go to Ms. LaRouche, and we'll not take that time away from your and I discussion there. Luc, Ms. LaRouche.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Donc, quand on parle d'une
When you look at the general context, for example, the government of Quebec has to be in a position to pay the revenues that it has collected. It has to be an ongoing continuum from the tax return filing up until collection, as is done for the GST. As regards this, we have a national system in place. As a result, Quebec, that is, the regions aren't simply serviced by Quebec employees, but we deliver services throughout Canada. And some employees work on corporate tax returns for Quebecers in Summerside and on PEI. The purpose here, the objective, is to demonstrate that there's a level of complexity involved in. So first of all, there is a continuum of service. We have to consider not only the tax filing, but all of the exercises of validation and verifying of collection of objectives, appeals, and so on and so forth. That is how we're organized. There's another item I'd like to raise, and that has to be taken into account, as Mr. Marson mentioned. That would be the difference between the tax systems. Given the some 100 differences that exist between the various measures that exist, it is such that the data we don't always ask the same information. And a single tax return would not make these differences disappear. If I may.
Go ahead. Mr. Berthold?
Yeah, merci. Je ne parle pas de l'administration.
I'm not speaking about the complete administration of collection in the entire tax system. I'm simply saying that it would be a good idea to give an opportunity to Quebecers to fill out a single form that could be sent to CRA and Revenue Quebec if required to ensure that Quebecers have only a single form to fill out. With that simple step, is that a possibility? It's possible because we do it elsewhere in other provinces and territories. The only issue I would have is, given the complexity and differences in the two tax system, it will be a very long questionnaire. If you look at the current tax return software, in fact, we're making substantial efforts to do this electronically and to fill in the various fields to simplify as much as possible the production of the tax return. So we're continuing, and we are working with Revenue Quebec to improve the client experience. Nevertheless, there's a certain reality, that is, there's a difference between the systems, that it will not be so simple to have a single form. It will exist, but it will remain complicated given those differences.
Mr. Fraser for 6 minutes, followed by Mr. Gabriel. Mr. Fraser.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I will be splitting my time with my colleague, Mr. Sorbera. Before I get to the question I'd like to hear from officials on, I do want to say I'm sympathetic to the decentralization argument as someone who knows that that our staff, federal staff in Ottawa, are responsible to measure the sea ice conditions between you and I, Wayne. So I do want to, though, draw attention. The biggest objection that I have, and I did vote in opposition to the motion when it was on the floor of the House. The biggest objection I have is really relates to the system of benefit delivery that we have in Canada. We're proposing now, and it was outlined in the most recent throne speech, to create an automatic tax filing system. I know some of the most dramatic cases we have in our office come from families who've not filed their taxes and don't realize that they're eligible for sometimes $20,000 or $30,000 in back payments for the Canada Child Benefit. I'm curious if officials would have commentary on the impact of the proposed bill on our ability to move to an automatic tax filing system, or more broadly on the delivery of benefits through our tax system, whether it's GIS or maybe some of the emergency benefits through the pandemic. But I'm curious how you think this bill would potentially impact our system of delivering benefits.
Ms. LaRoche? You're muted, Ms. LaRoche.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for your question. Basically, right now, and for a number of benefits, we can think about the Canada Child Benefit, we can think about the GIS, Guaranteed Income Supplement, all the income-based information benefits that we have are based usually on tax data. So a person will file, as you mentioned, and then will get their benefits. So in the event that, Quebec would be doing the Quebec portion of it, there's going to be a need to rewire that whole relationship in terms and figuring out who does what in terms of the
there you go.
Okay.
Just if you could back up a little there, you're back on now again.
Hey, not sure how far I need to back up, but basically to say that we would need to rewire the system because the income information would not come from the same place. You would have two sources of data, potentially, from Quebec and from Ontario. I would say that the other consideration to take into account is just timeliness. If you look at COVID and other things where we had very little time, now we're talking about changing potentially two systems as opposed to one system and working with a province to institute or put together federal benefits. And then because there's some consideration that it can comply with those types of benefits. And in terms of the just the automated tax filing, I would say that the same type of consideration apply. It doesn't impede us from actually being able to do it. It's just now that it's actually, we need to coordinate and make sure that we enhance and that the Revenu Québec in this particular case would be in accord with, the approach that we want to take, because they would have an integrated system from a provincial and federal point of view.
Okay, going over to Mr. Sabara, and I might say that any of the other witnesses who might have something to add, just raise your hand or yell, and I'll catch you. Mr. Sabara.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to my honorable colleague from Nova Scotia for splitting his time. I'm going to say the question in French because we're touching upon a subject that impacts the residents of Quebec. This is for the representatives from the CRA.
In spite of what the opposition parties say on savings that might occur, and that would happen with a single tax return administered by Quebec, the Robillard Commission published its report in 2015 that concluded that quite the contrary, transferring administration of tax filings to Revenu Québec would save $400 million by the province. Did you read that report? And if so, what does the CRA think about it? Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. It cut off a little, but I think I heard your question properly. We are aware of the report from the Robillard Commission that happened a few years ago. The CRA did not make any analysis for comparison purposes, but if we look at the current experience, about the fact that Revenu Québec administers sales taxes, interpretation will resume when the sound quality will be adequate. It would be much higher than what the CRA spends right now. Thank you.
Some technical difficulties for sure. Turning to Mr. St. Marie, followed by Mr. Julian. 6-minute round. Gabriel?
Oui, merci, monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Easter. First off, I would like to greet the representatives from the Finance Department and from the CRA. Thank you, Mr. Marcelin, for starting in French. It was much appreciated. As Wayne said already, Ms. Laroche, your internet connection is too weak and we don't always understand your answers. But I still have 2 questions to ask you, Ms. Laroche. But first off, I want to make a short comment. The Robillard Commission was a partisan commission, and its recommendation, or that specific recommendation, was rejected by the Liberal government, and it was also rejected by opposition parties. Ms. Laroche, I'd like to go back to your presentation. At the beginning, you said something, and my 2 questions will be about it. So the first thing that you mentioned in your presentation was that it convincing international partners to amend tax treaties in order to include subnational administrations would be a hard sell. Let's take the example of the US-Canada agreement. At Article 3, it says that in Canada, a competent authority is, in Canada, the Minister of National Revenue or their authorized representative. End of quote. So the Minister of National Revenue can decide who she authorizes. And it's the same in other agreements to share tax information. The only thing that the minister has to do would be to notify the U.S. or other partners. So what would prevent her from doing so? Does she think that other countries would refuse to abide by a treaty because they don't like the person that was authorized by the minister? Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I will start answering, but I will also invite my colleague Andrew to answer, since the Department of Finance is the department that negotiates those treaties and we administer those treaties. So we each have our own role. We have over 100 treaties and international agreements that supervise our interactions abroad. I could not tell you whether the U.S. would accept our delegation or not. That's a question that you should ask them. But usually we deal with national counterparts, not with subnational counterparts. But I will let Andrew add if he wants to add anything, and I hope my internet connection was adequate. Mr. Marshland?
Jovanik?
Maybe I can answer. So maybe a bit of context here could be helpful. Je vais vous donner un peu de...
I'll give you some context. I think that will be useful. Canada has roughly 120 international tax treaties and to share information. 1/3 of those agreements has clauses that say that in some situations, the federal authority, in this case, Revenue Canada, could share some information with a subnational authority as long as there would be repercussions at the provincial level. So there are exceptions in some of the treaties that allow that change, but we'd have to see if those exceptions were created by all of the parties based on the current system to collect taxes. It's not clear that if the federal system was decentralized and if one province had more power, well, it's not clear that those rules in those treaties would be interpreted the same way. So perhaps we would need more negotiations with our international partners. So I'd say that it's the case for 1/3 of the agreements that we have, as I said. If not for the other situations, no such exceptions exist.
Mr. St. Marie, we'll give you a little more time, Gabriel, because those were long answers. Go ahead.
Okay, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. So to me, it looks pretty simple. So there could be an exchange of letters. Second question, Ms. Laroche, you said that most benefit programs such as the GIS, the child benefit, are based on information that are in tax filings, since people have to file their taxes to get those benefits. Here's my question. If the Quebec-Canada agreement says that all of the information must be shared, will Canada get all of the information necessary on the income from the previous year to provide the benefits? Do you think that Quebec could not comply with the rules of transferring information? Thank you for the question. As I said earlier, information exchange happens every day between departments and various levels of government. So there's two questions. What are the terms in the agreement? Who would be administering the information? Where would the role of the federal government end, and where would this role of the provincial administration start? So it's more of a technical detail. We'd have to make sure that the flow of information is smooth, and we would have to be able to make changes quickly when some changes have to be made. For example, during the pandemic, the amounts were increased within a few weeks only in order to help Canadians. So there would be additional costs if, depending on the deal that would be negotiated. Thank you.
Thank you all. Turning then to Mr. Julian, who will be followed by Mr. Lawrence. Peter?
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to our witnesses. We hope that you and your families will keep safe during the pandemic. Thank you very much for your work. Thank you for everything that you do for our country. Ms. Laroche, I'll start with you because it's obvious that the discussion has been ongoing for a few years. It's clear that within the CRA, there have been discussions around today's topic because you talked about job losses and possibilities for benefits. I'd like to know what discussions happened internally on how we could implement having a single tax return. Thank you very much for the question. The conversations that we've had were at two levels, so we continue to work with all of the provinces and territories so that we have forms that are as simple as possible for taxes, and in particular with Quebec, we've started discussions to simplify some forms to see where we could simplify the customer experience for our taxpayers. So now you're going to tell me that it is not a single document, but that's the first step. And I would like to underscore once again that there's just so much we can do to simplify the form given the differences that exist. For example, the basic definitions of income are not the same, which leads to more data. So these are the discussions that we've had so far in order to try to improve the customer's experience. And as I said in my opening remarks, we work with software developers in order to have an integrated experience for Quebec taxpayers. So you never conducted any study, you never discussed how having a single tax return could be implemented. So you've had discussions, as you were saying. You've discussed how the process could be simplified, but you haven't had discussions on how to implement a single tax return. Here's my next question, because you've referred to potential job losses. Obviously, that's a concern to us. We are all for having a single tax return, but we do not want civil servants who work very hard lose their job. Did the CRA forecast job losses, or could there be scenarios where all of those jobs could be maintained, even if there were to be an agreement with Quebec whereby we would have a single tax return? Thank you very much for your question. The job losses that I mentioned in my opening remarks, well, they talk about the work that is done within the CRA. So there's the paper tax return, which is only the form that is integrated. And there's also the tax administration where Quebec would collect the taxes and would send it back to the federal government. So let's talk about the second element. So a provincial organization would get the federal taxes. So this system is a continuum of activities that contain a lot of steps. And if Revenu Québec were to become responsible for those functions, obviously the workload will decrease for the CRA staff. And naturally, the impact will vary depending on the terms of the agreement and depending on how the responsibilities will be shared. So does it mean that within the CRA, you've thought of scenarios that study what kind of agreements could happen? And so are you forecasting job losses? And if so, are these scenarios that you want to share with our committee?
We don't have such scenarios because of the nature of the current discussions. We have estimated the costs for set costs for such a transition by basing ourselves on the Ontario experience, so I can share that with you now if that interests you. And I can also share the current costs in the Quebec region to administer the tax system. All right, perhaps you could send that to us. And another question has to do with how we can ensure that these programs could also be used within a Canada-Quebec agreement. And do you have those scenarios within the CRA? We have not worked on that kind of scenario. All right.
Half minutes later on. Going to Mr. Lawrence, followed by Mr. Masiewicz. Mr. Lawrence.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank the witnesses. I am used to having marauding children in poor rural internet, so I understand the challenges that can be, and so appreciate that. And the interpreter as well has done a terrific job through some choppy internet. So thank you. I'm thinking of a phrase that I heard my childhood, that water can't get any more wet. And so when I look at the CRA, and one of the things that you're presenting to us is the fact that if we put the provincial in there, to have that, the coordination will be impossible, or it will be difficult at least, which could cause things like systems not talking to each other. Like systems like the CRA not being able to talk to HDRC, which are preventing people who are desperately in need of benefits from not getting them, because these two systems can't talk. Systems that have people online for literally hours waiting desperately to get a hear that it costs thousands of dollars the CRA cannot respond to. Water cannot get any more wet is the response. So when we look at these things, miscommunications like not being able to tell people whether CERB benefits are gross or whether they're based on gross or net. These failures, like how worse could it get if Quebec was involved? I have trouble fathoming it. Despite these billions of dollars that the parliamentary secretary talked about, they're in there. The CRA is failing Canadians, and I have challenged to see how this water can get any more wet. So maybe you could expand on that for me.
Thank you for the question. I'm just not sure on. In terms of the complexity, I just want to confirm the question being asked.
Yeah, my question is, we're in 2021. We have software that's spectacular that can do everything. They can drive cars by themselves, but we can't have software that can allow a province to talk to a federal tax collector. I just find that unfathomable.
So the tax system is, in terms of its administration, is extremely complex. If you just look at the law and all of the different types of provision, it is an extremely complex, necessitating like a lot of systems. And I would say that the CRA takes a lot of pride in the work that it does, and actually invests significantly in making sure that it updates the system and provides the best service it can to Canadians. What we're talking about is that we have established processes, we have established connections, we have established systems. If we take a part of the administration and we tell somebody else to do it, we need to unwire and rewire. Like, it is part of the fact that we have to create connections. And that takes investment and it takes time to do.
Thank you. Can I give the rest of my time, Chair, to Mr. Fast, our new Vice Chair, who I congratulate?
Yes, you can. Certainly you can. Go ahead, Mr. Fast. I think we would have time anyway, but go ahead, Ed, you're on. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just wanted to say thank you to all of you who've already reached out to me to welcome me to the committee. I'm looking forward to be a constructive voice at the table, even though it is like drinking out of a fire hose right now. I do have a question for Mr. Marsland. Our colleague, Mr. Saint-Marie, has assured us that his legislation facilitates what he calls, or he refers to as a benign agreement that simply makes the filing of a tax return simpler and more efficient. I'd like to hear your view as to what might happen if, over time, that so-called arrangement would evolve into a more significant right, say even a constitutional right, especially as judicial creep sets in. And the second part of that question is,
Ed, before you go to the second part, could you lift your mic or lower it a little? You're coming through.
I'm
there.
popping, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. The second part of the question is simply this: has the department already turned its mind to what the negotiations and an agreement with a province like Quebec might look like, and what safeguards would be built into such a benign agreement that would ensure that the federal government could extract itself from such an agreement if necessary?
Thank you for Mr. Chair for the question, and I think I'd begin the answer by saying that perhaps since the GST arrangement has come up a number of times, perhaps by drawing a distinction between that and what's proposed here. And under the administration of the GST, the administration is of a harmonized system. There's an agreement between the two levels of government to keep the system harmonized. So it is one system, essentially two parallel sets of rules that are virtually identical. As has been alluded to a number of times, there are differences in policy and law between the federal income tax system and the provincial income tax system. An example came up earlier in the discussion with childcare expenses, where Quebec has made policy choices to have a subsidized system, and therefore does not provide a deduction for childcare expenses. It provides a subsidy and a credit under certain circumstances. So there are very important differences at the core of the system. So I'm not sure it's a question of drifting apart, as they're not together now. And the discussion really isn't about harmonizing the two systems, because they reflect different, very important policy choices by the federal government over the time and by the provincial government over time. I'd begin by not saying it's not necessarily a question of drifting apart, as they're already apart, and that really kind of goes to the issue of a single tax return and the economies in compliance that can be achieved when you're dealing with two different systems. I hope that goes some way to the answer to the question.
Not completely. The focus of my agreement was more, would such an arrangement have built into it an opportunity for the government of Canada to extract itself should it deem necessary at any time in the future?
Well, I can't really say what would be in the agreement, which would have to be negotiated. But typically, these types of agreement, any type of agreement, have some kind of termination clauses in it. I think we'd have to consider what the if indeed there was an agreement that was operationalized and it was terminated at some point, then you'd have to consider what the implications that will be in terms of building a new system to replace the one that replaced the previous one.
Okay, we'll have to move on from there. I would say, Ms. LaRoche, on the complexity of the system, just keep in mind that this committee has recommended, I think, 3 times now, that we need a comprehensive review of the tax system to simplify it over time. It would take a number of years, but this committee, I think, is right. Twice at least, maybe 3 times. And the government needs to get to it, Andrew. Turning to you, Julie, Ms. Sirowitz, 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And I want to say thanks to our presenters today. I have a few questions. My first question goes to Ms. Laroche. Ms. Laroche, you mentioned in your opening paragraph that many jobs across the country would be impacted. Would you have an idea of, outside of Quebec, how many jobs would be impacted and in which provinces?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. So we do not have an impact like a quantum, because it would depend on the modality of the about is the fact that we have organized our workforce and our flow of work in such a way that to optimize our operations and also to ensure consistent service to all Canadians, regardless to where they live. So as a result, we've used things like centers of expertise across the country, and we also have national workload where it doesn't really matter where the request is coming from. It could be dealt with, if it comes from Quebec, it could be dealt with in Ontario, or it could be dealt elsewhere in the country. So in the event that this bill is passed and we come to an agreement, again, depending on the nature of that particular agreement, there would be a reduction in the workload of the Canada Revenue Agency. And as such, it would need less workforce to be able to do its work. So if we talk purely about the processing of T1, so individual and T2 corporation files, so these activities are for Quebec residents are primarily occurring in Jonquière, but also in Sudbury and in Summerside for the T2. So that gives you an example, and naturally other functions are everywhere elsewhere in the country. Thank you.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you so much for that. The next question I have is, you mentioned under efficiency and international taxation, you had mentioned, so if we go outside of your comment around convincing our partners to make changes to include other subnational tax administrations is not a given. If we set that aside and this moves forward and it's implemented, would you have any commentary about how this bill might impact the federal government's ability to continue to fight tax havens and to continue to fight tax evaders?
Well, thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. Maybe the comment that I'll make is that typically these large corporations do not just operate in one province. They do work, when they're everywhere in the world, including in all provinces and territories, and how they do business. So there would be a need for very close relations between the two, like administration, to be able to work probably collaboratively on files to be able to attain. So I would say that one of the first impacts that I see would be a need to have, a real collaboration in terms of looking at these kind of large businesses who have the dealings across the country.
Thank you. And my next question is, and this might not have been done, but has there been any type of an assessment about what would be the cost to CRA to retool, to readjust, if what is proposed in Bill C-224 is proposed? Has there been some sort of a costing to CRA versus what would be the cost savings in Quebec? Has anybody done that? And I don't know if that's you, Mr. Marshland, or you, Ms. LaRoche, but do you know if that type of costing has actually happened? Everybody's frozen now.
Well, hopefully, do you hear me?
Now I do, yes, thank you.
Okay. Okay, thank you for the question. So naturally, we haven't done any type of study in terms of the potential savings on the Quebec side, but we have looked at, I would say at a very high level to see what would be the initial impact in terms of cost associated. And we do have experience in that, not exactly in the same type of projects, but in the year 2000, we did take on the administration of the Ontario corporate tax, which is actually a much smaller project, and it was them coming to us as opposed, us giving a piece to a province. But we do have experience in these large types of projects. And we estimate, at a very, very high level that it would be a significant fixed cost in terms of the investment that would be required from a technological point of view, the increased coordination and everything. And, at a minimum, our estimate at this time is around $800 million at the minimum. So this would need
$800 million.
Yes. So
800 million. Wow.
Yes, but this would need, need to be refined and really based upon the agreement that would need to be taken from. But there is, as I mentioned before, there is significant consideration from an IT perspective, from a workflow perspective, from a staffing perspective, HR, real property. There is a lot of consideration. These are very complex agreements to be negotiated, and they do take time.
Okay, we'll have to end it. Thank you all on that round. We'll go to two and a half minute rounds, first with Mr. St. Marie and then with Mr. Julian. But before we start, because I know some people are probably worried on time, the app simulation and test now has been moved to 7:30 Ottawa time, so that gives us a little more time. We'll end after Mr. Julian. Mr. St. Marie.
Oui, merci Wayne pour la précision.
Thank you very much for that clarification for the vote simulation. I'm always flabbergasted when I hear that having one tax return rather than two would cost several $100 million more. That's impressive. But my question is, Mr. Marcelin, in your statement, you indicated that the federal government agrees to collect and administer provincial taxes almost at no cost. But as we know, the tax collection agreements in place with the provinces stipulate that it is the federal treasury that covers almost all of this revenue when they conduct audits, regardless whether or not the tax due is provincial or federal. So I'd like to ask you this. How much money has the federal treasury received thanks to this, because it collected provincial taxes outside of Quebec? If you don't have that answer in hand right now, as usual, you could transmit it to the committee. Thank you.
Si vous permettez, je peux prendre.
I can take the question. Let me just clarify how this works with the tax collection agreement. Canada Revenue Agency does an estimate of the provincial tax base to estimate the amount due from each province to each province. What is due to the provinces is based on a payable estimates. If taxpayers don't pay this, the federal government covers this debt. And yet, on the other side, the federal government keeps the interest and penalties that are then charged on unpaid tax liabilities. And it is the logic underlying this, because the provinces receive the full amount based on what was estimated. Then the federal government keeps the interest and penalties to offset their collection activities. I don't know if that answers your question, but I do believe it clarifies it somewhat. Well, that was already clear in my mind, but thank you for that answer. Let me clarify that either CRA or the Department of Finance can send that number as requested to the committee. How much has the federal treasury brought in thanks to this money, the fact that they collected provincial tax monies outside of Quebec? Thank you. And Wayne, I'll stop here. Earlier, you gave me more time. And we will have a vote rehearsal simulation, so I'll stop there.
Mr. Julian, for the last round, couple and a half minutes. Go ahead.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll turn the next question over to Mr. Janovich. Thank you very much for being here. You mentioned 120 tax agreements that are signed between Canada and other countries. So how many of these agreements are signed with countries that have already been identified or that are suspected of having taken part in tax evasion, in other words, tax havens?
Ed, you're on there. Okay. Go ahead, Mr. Janovich.
J'ai pas la réponse.
I don't have the answer to that question in hand. I think what underlies the question is whether or not there is an international definition of what constitutes a tax haven. There is not an actual definition based on the situation. The EU countries may have their own list, which contains a limited number of countries. But no doubt we will have to come back to you with an answer on that. But I think underlying here is exactly what we mean by a tax haven as such. But if you could do follow-up on this and convey the list to us, of course, we'll look at this. Perhaps we can look at other countries that already have such a definition in place. And I'm asking you these questions because, of course, from the outset, there was the notion that there would be an impact on the international tax situation if Quebec and Canada would sign a single return agreement. But it should be said that Canada really is not a leader in fighting tax havens. On the contrary, the country has received much criticism because we lose so much money in tax havens, and we haven't taken many measures to fight tax evasions. So given this backdrop, is there a study that exists at CRA which addresses the steps that must be put in place to avoid tax evasion? And have you studied how an agreement between Quebec and Canada might improve the situation, or whether it might have an impact on the strategies deployed to fight tax evasion?
Je croyais que la question était directe.
I thought the question was addressed to CRA. You don't want to answer? Are you sure? Thank you very much for the question. We have not conducted a study on the impact of a possible agreement regarding our activities aimed at fighting tax evasion. In the past, we did publish reports addressing this this tax difference. More specifically, when it comes to international observers, we could certainly convey that report to the committee.
I'll have to end it there. And there was a couple of questions for information, if you can provide that to the clerk, and on tax evasion, and I believe there's a couple of expenses to Ms. LaRoche as well. Okay, I would like to certainly thank the witnesses for appearing today. And we appreciate you coming before the committee and giving us your views. For the committee, on any amendments to this particular bill, I would suggest that if you could have them into the committee, to the clerk no later than Thursday, February 25th at 4 p.m. If there is anyone that has amendments. With that, we will have to go to the simulation vote, and we'll adjourn the meeting, and we'll see everyone on Thursday. Meeting adjourned. Thank you all.
you.